I've read one in on your website. You said that there isn't the right style of meditation. There isn't one right style of meditation, and you see these different practices, and and something works for one person, something works for another person. So I'm just curious, um, how does one distinguish what works for them, and what does that depend on, and like what is your thinking around that? Like, how do you help somebody discover like what practice they should be doing, because there's so much to choose from?
Yeah. It's a great question, and we run into this all the time. There's so much information available on YouTube and the internet and things like that, meditation apps, and people will find some meditation practice. And, when I start to work with them, I'll say, talk to me about your practices. And they'll say, I meditate. And I literally have to say, instruct me in your meditation as if you want me to do it, so that I understand what you're actually doing. Because meditation is so many different things that someone says, I meditate, that literally means nothing, right? You have no idea what they're actually doing. By the way, these four styles of ego transformation, they kind of unfold in one after the other as I was working through the perspective of Alethea coaching and sort of elaborating the model. Looking at my own experience, what I was seeing with my clients and students and working through that. Later, I discovered, much to my surprise, that the four styles of ego transformation actually line up perfectly with the four yogas of Mahamudra. Which I had, in theory, I had received a teaching on that probably from Dan even, years before, but somehow I wasn't connecting the dots. So maybe they were connected somehow in here, and it sort of unfolded that way, and then I kind of actually recognized the connection later. The other funny thing is that in the Diamond approach, Hamid has articulated four turnings of the teaching. And when I first heard him present that, I could understand the first two turnings, but then I got confused, and it seemed for me, I experienced him as being uncharacteristically vague or unclear about distinguishing those things. He's usually extremely clear in his teaching, and maybe it was me, maybe it was the teaching, I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't get it when I first heard it. And then many years later, he came out with the book, The Alchemy of Freedom, in which he describes the four turnings. And I read that, and lo and behold, the four turnings also map directly to these four styles of ego transformation. So I think that there's a pattern here that my point is that has been recognized in different traditions, not just something that I made up, but something that I tripped over and rediscovered, and then found evidence for and support for. But essentially, that is one of the things that gives rise to different kinds of meditation. So in our more advanced classes, our level 3 and level 4 classes, we actually teach a meditation system that's very similar to, although not identical to, the stages of meditation in Mahamudra. But essentially what we're doing is we're practicing, what is meditation at the depth of parts? There's a certain style of concentration meditation there, or shamatha, right? What is meditation at the depth of process? If you meditate at the depth of parts with good instruction, your practice will spontaneously drop into the depth of process. But you have to understand that you've dropped in depth, and that the object of meditation is now different at that depth.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what you may drop in depth and something else is starting to happen, but you're thinking, well, wait a second, I'm not doing the practice as I've been instructed. I need to go back to the object that I was instructed to pay attention to. But what that does is it just pulls you back into the depth of parts. So you need to be sort of taught and in a relationship with a coach or a teacher who can say, yes, actually what's happening is you've just dropped in depth. Now notice, here's the object of meditation at this depth. And if you do that well, you will spontaneously drop into the next depth. And as you drop from the depth of process into the depth of presence and absence, you go from what is often called concentration with support to concentration without support, into that open awareness state, right? And so it's helpful to understand that there is a progression that naturally can happen. And once more, you can go from that sort of gradual concentration into sudden awakening, which in the Buddhist sense in Tibetan Buddhism would be vipassana, right? These kind of special insight practice, right? And then so on and so forth. Things begin to move, etc. What I find is very often people are given a very advanced practice, like that fourth style of transformation. Someone might be given just a sort of, in Mahamudra, it would be called non-meditation practice, or a zazen, like an open shikantaza, open awareness, just sit. There's no instruction. Any instruction we give will actually not be the practice, right? The challenge with that is that it's so simple that it's tempting to teach that to beginners. And why give them all these distinctions and all these minutiae of the stages of practice if in the end that all has to be let go of, which totally makes sense. So let's just give them the advanced practice. In fact, the story that I have, which I think is true, is that when the Tibetan Buddhism first started to come into the West, many of the teachers were saying, we should just teach Dzogchen. Let's not go through all this other stuff, all these stages and Buddhist Tantra and preliminary practices and the Nandro and everything like that. Let's just go straight for, Dzogchen, because in some ways that parallels what Zen was doing. But what they learned is that very often people felt lost in those practices, and they struggled with those practices in ways that were resolvable by actually teaching basic competencies and skills, which then had them recreate the stage-wise path to that. So it can be very difficult if you're not familiar with a stage-wise path to have some sense of where you are on that path and what's the practice that's appropriate for you to be on that path at that particular stage. So unfortunately, the answer isn't like, how do you know you have the right practice for you? It's best to be in conversation with and in relationship with a teacher or a coach or someone who has a map of the terrain and can locate you on that map and can help you navigate that terrain with some skillfulness and some wisdom, right? That's ultimately the answer.
Yeah, I appreciate those insights and the way that you use the depth and how it maps actually with different meditation practices. And it's interesting because like in the Zen style, do nothing, zazen, just sit. It's
Right.
like the most simple, but it's also it's the hardest to do for somebody, I think, especially for the Western mind where we're all about doing things. So if you give somebody that practice, they're just like, what am I supposed to do? It's like, no, you're supposed to do nothing. And it's like, oh, how do I do nothing?
Right.
And it's because they're still kind of predominantly in the parts depth, like in this shallow space. So they don't know how to let go and just relax and not do anything. It's a lot more deeper. But that's interesting. And
Yeah, that's right. And those practices can be super powerful because to not do anything and to work with that, it's like it's its own koan. How do you do not doing, right? And it can be very deconstructive and very, very potent and powerful practice. And it really will work for some people. But what I noticed when I was practicing, and I practiced in a Zen lineage for a while, and I've had lots of students that come through that have been in Zen lineages with that kind of instruction. And what I notice is that it works, but it works for a small percentage of people. That most people actually need some kind of they're better supported by some kind of developmental stage approach to meditation where they're building basic foundational skills and then layering them on top of each other and slowly building up a capacity to do that. What I've seen in the stage-wise approach is people getting much deeper, much faster than in the kind of the simple just sit approach. So I want to make sure that, in talking about this, that what the situation is thank God we have all of this, because we really do need all of this. And some people need that, they don't need the stage-wise thing. They could just run with that kind of just sit zazen And that's beautiful. And I don't want to take anything away from that. That is wonderful. That happened to not be me, right? I
Yeah.
couldn't do that. And so naturally, where I've gravitated towards was something that was a stage-wise approach to that. And now that I've followed the stage-wise approach, mostly when I'm doing my own meditation practice, I am just sitting, right? But the difference is not the practice, it's the practitioner,
Yeah.
right? So it's who's sitting, right? It's actually what I do is I just simply drop into non-dual presence and then just sit. And so it's who's sitting that makes the difference, that makes that practice what it is, right? It's not the practice itself, because the practice itself is utterly formless. It has no, there's no instruction in some sense, right?